If you hear your own voice calling to you from below, don't answer it, especially if you're alone, especially if it sounds like something you were never meant to say. Welcome back to Haunted Real Estate. This is episode 3. Tonight, we take you to New Orleans, Louisiana, into the heart of the French Quarter, where jazz still lingers in the alleyways, and stories survive longer than names. At 617 Royal Street stands a narrow townhouse pressed between a bakery and an antique shop. It looks harmless, quaint, restored, but beneath the floorboards is a space long sealed, long denied, and maybe for good reason. The building has no known basement. That's what the listing says. That's what the city records confirm. But for the last century, every tenant who's lived upstairs has reported the same thing. Footsteps after midnight pacing directly below their bed and worse voices. Not strange ones, familiar. Voices that sounded like their own. Before we begin, I just want to say, I hope you're doing okay. However your day is gone, I'm glad you're here now with us in this space where we let the darkness unfold slowly. Where we sit with the echoes and ask not who's speaking, but why they remember us so well. So if you're ready, settle in, turn the lights low, and come upstairs with us to a house with no listed basement, but plenty of room beneath your thoughts. Because tonight, the voice you hear from below might know you better than you do. Dr. Violet Kerr arrived at 617 Royal Street on a quiet Tuesday in June with a suitcase of books and a voice recorder in her coat pocket. She was 36, a visiting researcher on sabbatical from the University of Chicago, where she taught cognitive behavior and sleep psychology. She had no interest in ghosts. She had chosen New Orleans because it offered both solitude and history. The kind of place where the walls had seen too much, and maybe a little of that would leak into her work. The building was narrow, 3 stories high, wedged between a shuttered antique store and a cafe that never seemed open. The rental listing described the apartment as refurbished, quiet, and ideal for writers. Violet needed quiet. She had brought with her everything she needed to spend 6 weeks in near isolation, working on a manuscript about dream cycles and identity drift. Part of her process always involved recording spoken notes. Her voice was sharper than she liked in playback, too clinical sometimes, but speaking ideas aloud made them real. The apartment had creaky floors, cool air, and windows that refused to stay open. It was fine, even charming, except for one thing. The floor plan listed no basement, but the stairs curved downward past the first floor hallway, ending in a small wooden door that had been sealed with painted over screws and a line of yellowed caulk. The landlord had told her not to worry. It was left over from renovations. The entire space below had been filled in decades ago. There was nothing down there anymore. Violet didn't ask questions. The first few nights passed without incident. She read, she wrote, she listened to recordings, and sometimes wandered the block in the humid evening light. She began sleeping with her recorder running, a habit formed years ago when a colleague introduced her to nocturnal speech pattern studies. Most of her files captured nothing more than rustling sheets, the occasional mumble, but it gave her something to analyze. One morning around 4 a.m., she awoke suddenly. The apartment was still, but there was a sound just beneath it. It wasn't the street. It was too close. Measured footsteps. 5 of them. Then silence. She held her breath and waited. The sound didn't return. But when she listened to the recorder later that day, it had captured the same footsteps. And then something else. Her own voice whispering softly, "Why are you still here?" She didn't remember saying it. The timestamp showed she had not moved for hours. The mic had been on the desk, 10 feet from her bed. She played it 3 times, slowed it down, checked for audio overlap. The waveform matched her tone, her pitch, but not her inflection. It was her voice, but it wasn't her intention. She made a note, flagged the file, and labeled it Subject Drift. 2 days later, it happened again, this time at 2:37 a.m. Another whisper, but clearer. The voice said, "Leave the door closed." And again, it was her voice. Calm, precise, exactly the cadence she used when lecturing students. She had not spoken that sentence in weeks. She stopped listening to the files at night and instead began reviewing them in the morning with coffee and daylight. She moved the recorder to different places in the room, once beside her bed, once near the bookshelf, once facing the door to the sealed staircase. Every time the same result. Footsteps, then silence, then a whisper. Sometimes it was a question, sometimes a command, always in her voice, always saying things she could not recall ever thinking. The dream journal she kept began to fill with strange entries, descriptions of rooms that weren't part of the apartment, reflections that blinked before she did, and once an image of her standing at the bottom of the sealed stairs looking up through the ceiling as if watching herself sleep. She started waking with the sensation of movement, not a dream, not a jolt, just the feeling that she had walked for hours and returned to a place just slightly misaligned from where she had started. One night, she placed a small handheld mirror at the base of the sealed door, angled to reflect anything that might move across the floor, and left the recorder pointed at it. In the morning, the mirror was turned, the angle reversed, and in the recording was the sound of wood shifting, followed by the soft rasp of breath near the mic, and a sentence whispered so low it almost vanished underneath the ambient noise. It said, "Stop asking questions." She stared at the waveform for a long time. Her coffee grew cold beside her manuscript untouched on the desk. The air inside the apartment grew heavier in the hours before sunset, and she began to dread the time between 2 and 4 a.m., when the silence stretched too long to feel empty. One evening, she spoke directly into the recorder and said, "If you're trying to tell me something, try harder," and went to bed early. When she played it back the next morning, the first half of her sentence had been replaced. Her voice now said, "If you were trying to find me," and then silence. The recording did not glitch. The transition was seamless. There was no evidence of audio manipulation. The file was continuous. Her voice overlapped itself without distortion. And something inside her began to shift. It wasn't fear, not yet, but recognition. Something in the apartment knew her rhythms, knew her pitch, knew how she framed her thoughts, and could speak in them, like a mimic, not perfect, but close enough that she began to hear herself even when the recorder was off. Violet began tracking the whispers, systematically labeling each with time, pitch, tone, and location, building a spreadsheet not for patterns of content, but for patterns of behavior. She noted that every message occurred within a window between 2 and 4 a.m., that they never repeated, and that they gradually shifted in intent. The first had asked, then warned, then mirrored her phrasing so precisely it left no doubt that something was studying her from the other side of the silence. One night, she set up a full audio triangulation with 3 devices placed at key points around the apartment, hoping to isolate a direction at 3:08 a.m. All 3 devices recorded simultaneously, not just her voice, but a question spoken once then again in a slight variation. "What do you think you are? Then, what do you think I am?" The tones matched hers, but the cadence was too still. Like playback slowed half a step without pitch distortion. When she played the 3 files back together, the echo was perfect, creating the illusion of her voice, circling her head in a space that didn't exist. The next morning, she found her own handwriting on a page. She hadn't written, "The journal?" Entry began mid-thought. "The mirror doesn't reflect anymore. It remembers the pen was hers, the ink fresh, but the syntax was foreign." She tore out the page and burned it in the kitchen sink. The scent lingered all day, and that night the recorder caught her laughing in the dark. A slow laugh that ended in the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs from below. Violet tried contacting the landlord, left a voicemail asking for records, blueprints, confirmation of when and how the basement had been sealed. No reply came, the number disconnected. 2 days later, she visited the local records office and found that while the address existed, the floor plan on file ended abruptly on the first floor, with the word storage void. Access denied, stamped in red. Over the lower half of the diagram, the clerk could not explain. The stamp only said the building had changed hands too many times to track. Frustrated, Violet returned to the apartment and found the mirror beside the staircase. Missing in its place was a note written on the wall, in pencil. Not yours. She checked her photos. The mirror had been real, placed by her hand. Yet now it existed only in the record, not the space. And that night she dreamed of a hallway with no ceiling, lit only by the sound of her own breathing. The next morning, she found a small handprint in dust on the floor beside the desk, too small for hers, too defined to be accident. The spiral of tension deepened not with violence but with recognition. The apartment was not becoming haunted. It was becoming familiar. More familiar than her own thoughts, and that terrified her. More than ghosts ever could. She attempted to leave. Packed a bag, walked to the front door, turned the knob, but it refused to turn. Not stuck, not locked, just indifferent. The metal cool and unmoved. She tried again at dusk and again at dawn, and then stopped trying. The apartment allowed groceries through a delivery hatch, but her phone stopped connecting to external numbers. Her emails remained unsent. Drafts auto-saved but never reached inboxes. The window faced a street she no longer recognized. The same buildings but the wrong angles. The shadows bent inwards. She began recording herself on video, hour by hour, and one day she watched a clip where her lips moved, but no sound came out, and then watched it again, and realized she had never recorded that moment at all. Her own reflection had begun to lag behind her motion, not in mirrors but in polished surfaces, spoons, dark glass. Her eyes blinked half a second late. She stopped sleeping but still woke up each morning with no memory of the previous night. Her dream journal now contained entries written in her mother's handwriting. Despite her mother having died 5 years ago, the journal began to refer to her in the third person. She walked into the basement last night. She smiled like she knew the way. Violet began whispering to herself, not words but tones. Fragments of phonemes that sounded like names she didn't recognize. She opened the sealed door one night, no longer painted shut, just slightly ajar. Inside was darkness, flat and dry, with a smell like old photographs and burnt wool. She left it open, placed the recorder at the threshold, and slept beside it. In the morning, the device was gone, and in its place was a new one. Older analog, still warm with a reel already turning. Playing her voice, not recent but younger, a tone she hadn't used in years. Asking questions from a thesis she had abandoned long ago. The apartment had begun to collect versions of her. She heard them at night, behind the walls, under the floor, and sometimes in the kitchen. Behind her own shoulder, whispering lines she hadn't written. Yet one evening, she stood in the center of the room and said aloud, "What do you want from me?" And the floor responded with a single creak, slow and deliberate, as if someone below had just taken a step toward the ceiling. She didn't speak again for days. She began to feel watched, not by something else, but by herself. Her own presence split into reflections that had memory. Her own habits anticipated by doorways that opened before she touched them. She stood at the top of the stairs one last time and looked down into the dark, and from below came a voice. Not echo, not mimic, but harmony. Her voice saying, Only, are you ready? Yet Violet descended the stairs slowly, barefoot, the air below, dry and still, neither warm nor cold, just indifferent like a place that had never been touched by sunlight. The basement had no visible walls, no ceiling, only a narrowing path defined by her own footsteps, echoing just slightly ahead of her. The further she walked, the more the echo slowed until they no longer matched her pace. Then, they began to anticipate her. The sound of her footfalls arrived a half second before her shoes touched the ground. She stopped. The echo stopped. She turned her head. The air shifted as if someone else had stopped breathing. A faint red light blinked at the far end of the path. She walked toward it, drawn not by fear, but by the rhythm of inevitability. There was a recorder on a table, the same model she had lost. It was already running. On the tape, her voice asked questions she hadn't yet formed, lines from pages she hadn't written. She sat in the chair beside it, and the tape kept turning. She pressed stop. The room fell silent. Then, from the dark corner of the space, a figure stepped forward. It was her. Not similar. Identical. Same posture, same scar above the brow, same blouse worn 3 days ago and never seen again. The other Violet smiled faintly and said, "You're late." The real Violet, or the one who still believed she was, didn't respond. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply understood. The chair behind the recorder was warm. She sat in it. The other Violet walked past her and up the stairs without looking back. The tape rewound on its own, clicked, began playing again. Her own voice reciting an entry from her dream journal 3 nights ago. She listened, and when it ended, she pressed record and began speaking softly, slowly, without hesitation. It felt familiar. It felt like what she was meant to do. Days passed or didn't. She no longer counted. The basement never changed, but neither did it stay the same. The shadows adjusted for breath and memory. Once she thought she heard another person moving nearby, but when she called out, the voice that replied was hers, sounding older, slower, and tinged with something like mercy, a tone she had never used. She left notes on the floor for no one, pages that folded themselves neatly after she fell asleep. The tape reel never filled, yet never erased. She rewrote her questions again and again, each time more precise. What do you want? What do you remember? What do you need me to forget? The answers never came directly, but in fragments of her own tone that taught her how to ask better. Upstairs, the apartment remained still. The lights flickered at the same hour each night. The groceries in the fridge never spoiled, though no one delivered them. A few months later, the next tenant arrived. The lease had been updated, the paperwork flawless. The sealed door was still closed, paint intact, untouched. She never mentioned hearing anything, not for the first few weeks. But her third audio file recorded something unusual, a whisper on the edge of hearing. It said, "Record everything." The woman laughed when she played it back, a voice like her own. Maybe just a joke, maybe the building settling, but she began recording just in case. Meanwhile, beneath her feet, a woman with no name and no memory traced questions into the dust of the table and waited for the next version of herself to arrive. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was just patient. Time lost meaning in the basement. Violet no longer counted hours. She measured time in patterns of thought, in how often the recorder clicked, in how quickly she forgot what question she had just asked. She did not sleep, not in any natural sense. She would close her eyes and open them again to a different arrangement of shadows, a different feeling in her muscles, like she had been writing for hours, or staring at the same sentence on the wall. Sometimes she thought she could hear another version of herself further down the hallway, pacing, muttering, testing phrases. One day, she stood up and found a new journal resting on the table. Not hers. A different notebook. The paper was thicker, the edges worn, as if it had passed through many hands. Inside were pages of mirrored handwriting. Her voice, her cadence, but the words were unfamiliar. They read like a transcript, not of thoughts, but of memories being played back, out of order. On the last page was a message written in bold ink. If you forget how you got here, start over. She folded the book shut and placed it beside the recorder. The other, Violet, had never returned. Perhaps she had become someone else entirely. Or maybe she had left something behind that now waited for the next. That night, the tape caught a new voice layered beneath hers. Faint, younger, and not quite human in rhythm. It repeated a name she did not recognize. Again and again. The name began to echo in her thoughts. When she tried to speak, her own name felt strange, like a mispronounced word. She began signing her notes with initials only. VK, then V, then nothing. By the time the basement's light shifted color for the first time from red to pale gold, she had already stopped writing. She just listened. The building above creaked like breath, expanding slowly. And somewhere beyond the edges of the basement, she could sense another door beginning to open. In the last days before her name fully slipped from memory, Violet began speaking only in fragments. She would mutter questions to the walls, then respond to them as if someone else had asked. The basement had no clocks, but her body remembered time in pulses, and how long the shadows lingered in one corner before sliding away. She stopped labeling recordings. The tapes recorded themselves now. Some mornings she would wake to find new reels, already spooled, marked with dates she didn't recognize and entries she didn't recall speaking. They sounded like her. They moved like her voice. But the content had diverged into something deeper, questions that struck like splinters, impossibly intimate. When did you stop being curious? What were you trying to prove? What would it take to make you leave yourself behind? The apartment upstairs stayed pristine. No dust, no rot. The bed always made. The kitchen stocked with food that never spoiled, but no tenant stayed longer than 6 weeks. They all left citing restlessness, unease, dreams they couldn't explain. None of them remembered Violet. Her name was no longer in the records. Her contract no longer existed. Even her faculty listing at the university had been removed, but the building still recognized her. Every night, the lights in the hallway dimmed exactly at 3:08 a.m. Every night, the same whisper came through the floorboards. Not menacing, not pleading, just steady, just familiar. Some said the basement had never existed, that the foundation of the building was solid stone. Others claimed it had been sealed during a flood in the late 1800s. There were no official blueprints, but those who had stayed in the apartment long enough to wonder always heard it, their own voice just beneath the floor, saying something they didn't remember saying out loud. The last thing Violet wrote was a single sentence etched into the underside of the recorder. The handwriting was faint, but unmistakably hers. It said, "I didn't mean to stay. I just never found the end." And with that, she became another echo in the loop. Another guide waiting in the dark. Not a ghost, not a warning. Just a familiar voice asking the next, Are you ready yet?" Months later, a real estate agency reopened the listing for 617 Royal Street. The file had been clean. No incidents, no formal complaints. The unit showed well, always pristine, quiet, full of character. The kind of place that made buyers feel like they had discovered something. A woman named Lauren signed a short-term lease. She was a painter moving from Baton Rouge looking for inspiration. She liked the creaky floors, the heavy doors, the sense that the building had lived longer than anyone inside it. On her second night, she recorded herself talking about her art process, a voice memo sent to a friend. The audio clip came back corrupted. not distorted, just longer. There was a section in the middle, her voice repeating a phrase she didn't remember saying. "This place knows what I want before I ask it." She laughed, blamed it on tiredness, but the next morning her recorder picked up something else. A whisper, the same tone, same pitch, same voice. It said, "Keep talking." Downstairs, the basement remained sealed. No handle, no draft, no indication that it had ever been opened. But sometimes, just after 3 a.m., the hallway light flickered, just once, and those who were awake claimed to hear two voices beneath the floor, one asking a question, the other answering it. The official blueprint still showed no lower level. City records remained unchanged. But more than one tenant has left the apartment with the same comment scribbled in the margin of their exit form. 5 words, always in their own handwriting. "I didn't live alone here," and maybe they didn't, because some places don't haunt you. They don't chase you or scream at you or scratch at the windows. Some places simply wait, and when they hear the right voice, they open. They don't need to call you in. They just wait for you to hear yourself. So if you ever find yourself in an old building, one that feels a little too still, a little too focused, and you hear your own voice whisper from somewhere it shouldn't be, don't answer. Because once you respond, the voice might not need you anymore. It might become you, and it will keep speaking for someone else.